historical texts relate to radical action, and it can totally be a dialogue. You can definitely interject. Come at me. Yeah. So some background to what I was thinking about while I was reading this book is that you probably know Freedom Bookshop in Whitechapel, the anarchist bookshop, and they're affiliated Freedom Press, and I was reading this comment piece where the writer was kind of essentially saying that he thought the difference between anarchism and other forms of radical lefty politics was that anarchism is less based on reading theory. And so there was this really great quote, in the same way the legal system is designed to be elusive and confusing, Marxist literature demands a significant amount of time and energy dedicated to decoding it. And while anarchism can fall into these pitfalls too, it's less based on reading theory. And so I thought this was this was kind of in my mind while I was reading this book, because I feel like a lot of contemporary anarchist discussion is around whether anarchism is best understood as practice or as politically and theoretically grounded. So whether this is Colin Ward books, how to bring anarchism into your everyday life, or the Zapatistas and in Mexico, who are obviously Whoop's famous touch point for contemporary anarchism, but who kind of say that they don't subscribe to a particular ideology. So this is kind of what was in my mind while I was reading this book, and I think this book is cool. So yeah, it kind of got me thinking about if you don't have to read anarchist writings to be an anarchist, then what is the value of anarchist writing? Where do we locate that value? So about the book, you may well know Alexander Berkman, famous anarchist, active around the turn of the 20th century, from Russia, runs in similar circles to Emma Goldman, wrote the ABC of Anarchism, was arrested after attempting to assassinate this American steel tycoon in the midst of workers' strikes, and this tycoon had hired these thugs who had killed 11-12 people, including a child, and he is then imprisoned in Pennsylvania, and he and other anarchists circulate this secret magazine that they call Prison Blossoms, and the remnants of it were published just a few years ago in this book, and it contains sketches and essays and narratives and poems, and I think it's really cool. So probably the most obvious thing that I can say about this book in terms of the relationship between text and action is that there are so many contexts in which reading and writing is in itself action, and so the anarchists who are in prison, they would communicate in code by banging on the pipes, and they enlisted other inmates to circulate this magazine that was tiny and made up of booklets that were the size of the palm of your hand, and there was this really great quote. Every available scrap of paper is exhausted. Margins of stray newspapers and magazines have been penciled on. The frayed tatters microscopically covered with ink. So I'm just I'm a sucker for a palimpsest, and I just love this image of literally writing into them margins of mainstream culture, and crowding out the local headlines just with radical writing. I thought it was great. But kind of in addition to the writing itself being action, I feel like it's kind of a useful text in terms of Berkman spends a lot of time reflecting on the nature of violent action, and it's really helpful to have his kind of view on his quote-unquote propaganda by deed. And I think this is kind of particularly important because this is something that comes up a lot. I'm probably preaching to the converted, but we're so in terms of thinking about what kind of violence is justifiable, we're so quick to say that historical violence is justifiable in the way that we're not for contemporary violence. So common touch point, something like the Battle of Cable Street is always seen as this turning point, this massive blow to the fascist movement in the UK, whereas contemporary Antifa violence is somehow more contentious. Yeah, so I think there's value in reading Berkman's take and seeing him become like less sure of his actions. And this isn't like an ideological shift. He just sort of realizes that like because Alecism is kind of widely misconceived as like synonymous with chaos and violence, like this is essentially bad press. And so, yeah, this is useful in terms of understanding the history of violent action. And something that really emerges in the book, which I found really helpful, is like contextualizing like the history of the movement and like the context in which anarchism is like understood either side of the Atlantic. So part of the reason that like Berkman's assassination attempt was not well received is because Americans at the time had this kind of conception that the work of the revolution was kind of done, and where anarchism existed, they just sort of tended to these like really individualist models, whereas Europeans had these kind of like communitarian precedents to draw upon, so sort of like early Christian sects or like medieval European free cities or like Russian like tribal communities. So they had this kind of tradition of sharing goods to pull upon, whereas Americans did not. And so, yeah, I felt like the book was really valuable in terms of understanding the kind of anarchist tradition in which you would want to act. And I think there's lots that we can learn from this book. Like, in terms of prison abolition, like one of the anarchists who's like a contributor to the magazine, Carl Knoll, he's talking about how like you should sentence people to a term in college rather than a prison sentence. Or Henry Bauer talks about how essentially in the kind of prison industrial complex people are put to work on things that they're not trained in, and then they're like beaten for their shoddy workmanship, and this kind of like links to wider discussions around people within the criminal justice system being blamed and punished for things that are like beyond their control. And so yeah, I think learning from history, what a revolutionary take. But I think part of this is also kind of demystifying foundational thinkers. So like with any kind of radical thought, foundational thinkers kind of acquire a sort of mythological status, I guess, and actually reading their writings a lot of the time is a really helpful way to see the ways in which they're fallible. And so, like, for instance, anarchists at the time, and still today, were very progressive in their views towards relationships, and, you know, particularly at the end of the 19th century, very revolutionary in terms of their ideas about, like, monogamy and marriage and expectations of family. But Berkman, in this magazine, is kind of unable to extend these ideas to, like, same-sex love, because he only understands this within the context of like exploitative relationships in prison, and so at this stage makes all kinds of homophobic comments, and so I think in terms of knowing the history, knowing the kind of fallibility of his thinking, and knowing like the kind of context within which we have to understand his ideas was really helpful for me in terms of thinking like what are the constraints upon what I think. Yeah, and just lastly, I love the kind of literary language in it. Like I think the prison blossoms, like the blossoms lend themselves to like, I don't know, the like ephemerality of the magazine, and like the spontaneous bursts of like vitality that come with it. And so yeah, I think it's a really valuable book, and I think it's really useful in terms of thinking about like what counts as action, how action can be understood in terms of its context, whether geographical or historical, and whether action is still useful even if you regret it later. So yeah, I've brought the book as a little bit of show and tell, and I have the ebook because I reviewed it, so if anyone wants it, you can definitely have the ebook. Prison Blossoms by Alexander Berkman and Carl Nold and Henry Bauer and various other anarchists. And hang on, I'll hold it up.
Let's see it.
You can read it if you want. That can be the other party. Yeah, I think that was everything I had to say on why I think the book is cool. Who am I introducing, sir? Skitter. You all already know.
Yeah.